So in this video I'm going to show you how to run 32-bit plugins in a 64-bit host that doesn't natively support 32-bit plugins using a nifty piece of software called jBridge. Now, although the process of using jBridge is relatively simple, there are a lot of factors which I think you should be aware of before you use it and while you're using it in order to get the best from it. In addition to that, jBridge can also be used for running 64-bit plugins in a 32-bit host and for running 32-bit plugins in a 32-bit host. Why might you want to do that? Well, I'll come to that in just a second. So yes, I am going to run through an example of using jBridge to bridge a 32-bit plugin into a 64-bit host, but I think it's also helpful to go over some basics so you know what you're doing and why you're doing it. Now, throughout this video, I am mainly going to be talking about Cubase because that is currently my DAW of choice, but this applies to any 64-bit piece of digital audio recording software which does not natively support 32-bit plugins. And this also includes Ableton Live, which went 64-bit a couple of years ago. Now, I'm going to be as untechy as I can be, which is not going to be very difficult because I'm not a massive techie. I am a bit of a nerd, but I'm not a massive techie. So let's start with this 32 and 64-bit thing. Now, essentially, it's a matter of memory. The more bits you have, the greater the precision and the more memory you can address. If we use a musical analogy, a popular process is to run your audio through an 8-bit processor. This creates a very retro lo-fi sound. Now, if you are of a certain age, you may remember that early samplers were only 8-bit and then became 12-bit samplers and then 16-bit samplers. And the more bits they had, the higher the resolution and the more accurate the digital samples were. So getting back to our plugins, a 32-bit plugin can only address 4 gigabytes of memory. If your computer has 8 gigabytes or 16, 32 or 128, a 32-bit plugin will still only be able to access 4 gigabytes. And if it hits the limit, it could quite easily cause the application to fall over and crash. Now, I read a very interesting comment in a post about Ableton when they were moving over to 64-bit. And they said that 32-bit versions of Ableton crashed 44% more often than 64-bits. And most of those crashes were down to memory problems and memory limitations. Now, when Steinberg dropped support for 32-bit plugins and went 64-bit only, there was a lot of consternation amongst users because, of course, this meant that they could no longer use existing 32-bit plugins. And there was the same level of consternation with Ableton. However, it's easy to see why these developers decided to go 64-bit only. For one, a 64-bit application is going to be a lot more stable than a 32-bit application, purely in the memory department. It's going to be able to address more memory and it's not going to fall over because of memory problems, at least technically it shouldn't. It also means that developers can spend all their time on developing 64-bit applications and don't have to split their time between developing and supporting 32 and 64-bit applications. So theoretically and technically, this is going to be a win-win situation for the consumer. Although when you have a bunch of 32-bit plugins that you can't use, it may not seem that way. Now, prior to Cubase going entirely 64-bit, the program did support 32-bit plugins, and it used an application or a piece of code inside the program, I believe called VST Bridge. And that did a similar job to jBridge, although according to some reports it was a little bit flaky at best. Having said that, I was using Cubase and 32-bit plugins, blissfully unaware of the existence of a VST bridge quite happily, and I don't think I had any real problems with it. And according to those who know, at least better than I do, jBridge does a better job of bridging the 32-64-bit gap than VST Bridge. Now, before we get into the workings of jBridge, there's a couple of other things to discuss. The first is, although this is a very neat piece of software, now I've been using this for a year and a half, or perhaps 2 years, and I don't think I've had a problem with it, but I haven't really pushed it to its limits. It is not an absolute 100% panacea for running 32-bit plugins, and problems may still develop for a number of reasons. There may be memory problems. The plugin may not have been written as well as it could have been, so that itself may cause problems. So you just need to be aware that this is not necessarily going to solve all your 32-bit plugin problems. Although again, as I say, I haven't had any problems with any of the plugins that I've thrown at it in the past year or two. However, you need to be aware that problems may arise, probably more with specific plugins than in a general nature, but there are a lot of FAQs on the site which you might want to read before you go into this. I am using jBridge on the PC. There is also a version of jBridge for the Mac. Now, I haven't used a Mac for a good number of years, so I'm afraid I can't comment on that at all. But I would like to explain in my non-techie way my understanding of how jBridge does its stuff. You need, of course, a 32-bit plugin which will be in a particular folder. Now, when you run the conversion program, jBridge will look at the 32-bit plugin and create a couple of other files. The main thing to realize here is that you cannot move any of these files, otherwise the system won't know where to look for the bits of information that it needs. So you have the original 32-bit and the two other files which need to stay where they are. Now, if you move them or delete some of the conversion files, you just need to run the conversion program again and it will sort everything out for you. Now, another thing which I feel I ought to mention, although in retrospect it seems pretty silly, but it is a thought I had when I first investigated this process. jBridge does not create 64-bit versions of 32-bit plugins. That would just be a magic solution and make the whole process totally unnecessary. jBridge does create a DLL with the same name as the original plugin, but this is not a 64-bit plugin. So you can't use jBridge to create 64-bit plugins or even 64-bit bridging files which you can move to another computer. You need to run jBridge on that computer. It needs to install certain files which Cubase or your 64-bit DAW will read, and then it can do the bridging conversions. In short, just run the program, do the conversion, and leave the files alone. If you do have to move them, then run the program again. Now, as I said earlier, jBridge can also bridge between 64-bit plugins and a 32-bit host. I'm not totally sure why anyone might want to do that unless you are absolutely totally wedded to a 32-bit host. But even now, most software developers, not all of them, but most of them seem to produce still 32-bit and 64-bit versions of their plugins. However, a little bit more intriguing is the fact that it can bridge 32-bit plugins to a 32-bit host. Why might you want to do that? Well, the whole point of jBridge is to overcome the memory limitation of a 32-bit plugin, which might cause the host application to crash. So if you are running a 32-bit DAW and find that certain plugins cause it to crash, you could run jBridge to convert that plugin into another 32-bit plugin to help overcome the memory limitations which is causing the crash. However, in the name of progress, we're going to mainly be concentrating on converting 32-bit plugins to run in 64-bit hosts. So, with all that background out of the way, let me dive over to my music machine and take you through the process of converting a 32-bit plugin into a 64-bit plugin. And there are a few settings in jBridge which I will go over as well, which you might find useful. So the first thing you have to do, of course, is to download and install jBridge, and you will find it on J's Stuff's website. I will leave a link to this in the description, of course. There are versions for Mac and PC. I haven't used a Mac for a while, so I'm concentrating on the PC version. There is a lot of information here. My eyes are not particularly good, and I do find this dark text on a dark background difficult to read, but I'm sure you will have no problem. There is lots of information here about it, and there are links off to FAQs. I have covered some of these in the video, but you might want to read all of them. So download the software, run the installer, and we'll take it from there. This is the download link. Now, one of the important things to note is that, as it says, this is a demo version, and even the developer says you really need to download and try the demo version to make sure that it works with your system and it converts the plugins that you want to use before you buy the full version. Now, the demo version works in exactly the same way as the full version, except saving and loading are disabled. and it goes silent after 20 minutes, after which you have to restart your DAW. However, it gives you plenty of time, plenty of opportunity to fully test it to make sure that it works with your system. As I say, it worked perfectly fine with mine, but as they say, your mileage may vary. So make sure that you do test it and you're happy with it and it does everything you expect of it before you buy the full version. Now, on another note, I realise that throughout this video I've been using the word converting rather than bridging. Now, as you will have realised by now, the program does not convert anything. It just forms a bridge between the 32-bit plugin and the 64-bit host. However, in the early days, I have to say that I thought of it as converting, so this is a mental thing I have. So I use that word, so I apologise if that causes any confusion, but as long as you know that it doesn't convert anything, it forms a bridge, and we should all be okay. Now, when you download more software, it really likes to put a shortcut on your desktop. jBridge does not do that, possibly because it's a friendly installer, or maybe it realizes that this is not a program you're going to use every day. So to access it, you need to go to the Start menu. You can, of course, create a desktop shortcut for it if you want, but if you press the Windows key and then press the letter J, it pops up here very helpfully. So we will run the program now. As I said, my eyes are not too good, so I'm going to switch on the magnifier, which should also help you see what I am doing if you find this little window in the middle of the screen a little bit difficult to read. So the first thing you have to do is to decide if you're using a 32 or 64-bit host. We are, or at least I am, using a 64-bit host. So click on that. Now there are several options here. Now, you can probably get away with using the default, and the first time I used it, that's all I did, but there are a couple of things you will want to check. So these are all ticky boxes. You just have to make decisions about what you want to do. So the first thing asks if you want to confirm each file individually. Now, jBridge will look in a folder, and if there are lots of plugins in that folder, it will convert all of them. So if you want to check each one of them as they are being converted, you might want to check this box. But if you're quite happy with the conversion process, then leave it unchecked, and jBridge will just do a batch conversion. So the second one I think is useful. It just checks to make sure that the DLLs are in fact VST plugins. There are more a DLL file. DLL stands for Dynamic Link Library. It's a bit of a nerdy techie thing to know, but it doesn't mean to say because it's a DLL that is a plugin. So this checks to make sure that it is. I find it useful to leave it checked. Some people have suggested that if you are struggling with a particular plugin, this is one of the options you might try unchecking. But I have never had a problem leaving that checked. Now this option asks if you want to replicate the subdirectory that the plugin is in. You might have noticed that some plugins have subdirectories and possibly even subdirectories. So you can check this or not as you wish. I just find it useful to maintain any directory structure, so I leave it checked. This asks if you want to create plugin files for 32-bit plugins, which yes, of course we do. So this is checked. And the next one asks if we want to create plugin files for 64-bit plugins. It probably wouldn't do any harm to leave it checked, but if I had a 64-bit plugin, I'm running it in a 64-bit host, so there's no point to leave that checked. Now this one is interesting. It's interesting, but it's annoying at the same time. This will reset the folder paths as you are searching for plugins to convert and the destination. Now I'm so used to using Windows Explorer's file menu. This uses what I consider to be a slightly antiquated file explorer system. You'll see what I mean when we get to that section where it expands folders, and I just find it very easy to scroll past the particular folder you're looking for and move on to the next hard drive or the next folder or something like that. I'll show you what I mean when we get there. But if you have all the plugins you want to convert near to each other, I find it best not to do a reset. If they are scattered all over your hard disk and in various folders, then you might want to do the reset. As I say, you'll see more about this when we get to it, but I leave it unchecked. So finally, there are these two options. It recommends that you create a specific directory to store all the converted files in. Now, I didn't know exactly what was going on here when I first started to use the program, so I just went with the recommended option. And I certainly do recommend that you go with this option. The second option is to put the converted files in the same directory as the files that you are converting. Now, if you do this, it means that your host software will scan this folder and possibly see the plugin twice, which may cause some confusion. I also find it very useful to note that all the converted files are in one place. So if there's a problem or if I need to find a particular converted file, I know exactly where to go for it. So I would certainly agree that the recommended option is the one to go for. Now, there is also a ticky box below that which says don't add 32 or 64 to the file name. Now, when jBridge converts a file, which we'll see in a second, it will add, in this case, a 64 to the end of the file name. Now, if you tick this box, it will not add a 64 to the end of the file name. Personally, I find it useful to have a 64 at the end of the file name, because when I'm sorting through the plugins, if I see a 64, I know, aha, yes, this is a converted 32-bit plugin. So it immediately tells me that this has been converted. I find that useful. You may not. However, just a little tip here. If you have an old project which used the old original 32-bit plugins and you're trying to open it in a 64-bit application, then the application will, of course, look for a plugin with the original name without an appended 64 to the end of it. So if your main purpose is to open old projects in a new 64-bit application and reuse the old 32-bit plugins, then that is a box you may want to tick. I hope that makes sense. So I'm not trying to open old projects with old plugins, so I'm just going to leave that unchecked and click on this option. So this is what I mean by the old version of Windows Explorer. If you click on an item, it shows you everything on your computer. If you click on a folder or a disk drive, it expands. I just find that confusing because I often scroll past the thing that I'm looking for. Anyway, no big deal. So I'm going to try to convert a program called Cynthia, which sounds very synthy. I actually can't remember what this is like at all. I had a computer crash a few weeks ago. It was obviously something which I didn't use a lot, otherwise I probably would have remembered it. But this is just by way of an example. So when I select the folder, you can see that there are two DLLs in there. Now, you can either simply select the folder, in which case jBridge will try to convert every DLL it finds in the folder, or you can select individual DLLs if you only want to convert one. So in this case it has two, a Cynthia and a Cynthia FX. So let's go for both of them. So I will just select the folder and click on OK. Now jBridge wants to know where I'm going to put the files. So I have created a folder in my program files folder called jBridge converts. There it is. So I'm just going to select the folder and click OK. Now this is just what I do. I'm not saying it's the best way to do things. You can organize your converted files however you wish, but I just find keeping them all in the one folder makes it very easy if I need a check on a plugin and find out where it is. So you get this dialog box. It doesn't take long to do the bridging files. So we'll click on OK here, and that should be it. So let us select Cubase 10 or 10.5. I think I'm running here now, and an empty project, and let us create an instrument track. And I find it easier to type in the name and to scroll through the list. So what have we got? We have Cynthia 64. So you will see that it has added the 64 to the end of the name. And let's load this. Can we get rid of the magnifier now? So Cynthia is the EMS VCS3. That's a blast from the past. This is another one of the synths which I desperately wanted back in the day. How could I forget this? That's fun. Okay, so here we are. So there we go, we have the 32-bit Cynthia plugin being bridged into the 64-bit Cubase. We might as well have a look at the effect, Cynthia effect, since we are here. This will be off the screen since I have set Cynthia to fill the entire recording area, but in Cubase I'm in the sends the effects section and typed in Cynthia, and there is Cynthia FX64. And this is Cynthia Effects. It's the same program. What the developer has done obviously is to create this piece of software and set one to be an instrument and another to be an effect. So you can use Cynthia as an effect as well as an instrument. So that's quite interesting. Okay. Now there's one more thing I want to mention before we leave Cynthia, and that is if you look at the bottom of the plugin window, I've got the magnifier on again, you will see a settings option. Now there are some personal details to the right which I've blocked out, but it's just my email address. I'm easy enough to find on the internet if you desperately want to get in touch with me, and of course you can always leave a comment below. However, if you click on the settings menu, down here, you get a list of options. Now these are essentially for troubleshooting any problematic plugins, any problems that you might have. Now I have never used any of these, I've never had to. A lot of them are to do with GUI problems, the display is not showing up properly or perhaps being corrupted. So I just wanted to point out the settings and where they are if you are having problems with a plugin. But if you're not having a problem, then I wouldn't mess with any of these. I can't tell you specifically what they do. A lot of them are self-explanatory, or you can sort of work out what they might be doing. But if you are having trouble with a plugin, you could try switching on and off various options in the settings folder and then save them. But I'm not going to do that because so far I haven't had any problems. Now I'm just going to show you inside the folder because I think this is important as well. So I'm just going to close this down. So if we go to Program Files and jBridge Converts, there is the Cynthia.64 and the Cynthia FX.64. Now you will also notice there are two text files. So if we have a look inside one of these, you can see that it shows you where the original file is. It gives it an ID, and this is information. So jBridge, when it's doing the bridging, it can find the original file and do the bridging process. So as you can see, the conversion program is fairly simple and straightforward. I hope you found the comments on some of the options useful. I also hope you found the background information which I gave you at the beginning of the video useful. So I have two more things to say before we wrap this up. The first is jBridge is a bridging program. It's to bridge the gap between 32 and 64-bit. It is not a substitute for using 64-bit plugins. So if you are running a 64-bit host, I would certainly suggest trying to concentrate on acquiring 64-bit plugins rather than using old 32-bit plugins as a substitute. Now, as I've said, I've been running this for a couple of years and not had any problems, but the way forward is certain to go totally 64-bit. Now, I've been using jBridge in the main to explore 32-bit plugins, which are, in my opinion, unique and for which there are not really any modern equivalents. I do intend to make another video about these fairly soon. So I'm using it to access and integrate software which would otherwise be difficult to access or integrate in any other way. Now finally, jBridge itself, it is not alas free, however it is very, very affordable. It is currently 14.95 euros, which is about 12 quid, 12 Great British pounds, and that's probably around $20. You can't buy a plugin for that. And as it gives you access to a whole shed load of 32-bit plugins, should you wish to go down that path. It is very, very, very reasonably priced in my opinion. So that's it for this video. I am by no means an expert on jBridge, but if you have any questions about it or about the conversion process of 32-bit plugins that you think I might be able to answer or help with, then do leave a comment below and I will reply as soon as I can and do my best to answer them. And if you did find this video useful, then please do consider subscribing and ringing the bell so you get informed of new videos as soon as I release them, and click the big thumb. It all helps the channel enormously and I really do appreciate it, and I do appreciate you taking your precious time to watch these videos and listen to my music, although I know there was no music specifically in this video. So for that, thank you very much indeed, and I will see you in the next video.